This is the Drupal Batch API. I've got some live demos and things, but if we need to cut it short, we can do. So this talk was built out of frustration, really, in that recently I was trying to do some batch work, and I was coming across the same resources that I've always come across, which includes a blog post I wrote in 2012 called "Smack My Batch Up." Hilarious. But I realized when writing all this stuff that was wrong. So I've recently, when Duncan approached me recently and said, "What do you want to talk about? Do you want to give a talk?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do this." Didn't realize it would be maybe the most technical talk of the conference. But yeah, so this is me, Phil Norton. I'm a developer at Code Enigma. Right, it's Hashbang Code a lot, every couple of weeks, and also co-organizer of in WDoug. You can find me on these socials at the bottom here, which is on most of the slides. So the source code, so the talk is available on this QR code that takes you to a README with a bunch of happy links on it. All source code can be found at that bit.ly link as well, so don't worry about writing any of the examples down, it's all available online. And I've also written about the Batch API there. So, this Batch API thing. So, yeah, so the basic definition is, it allows us to split complex tasks into smaller chunks in order to save memory and performance problems. But then, what problem are we solving really? I mean, let's look at Batch as a whole. So fundamentally, users get bored quickly. This is from a Cloudflare study that said that a 5-second page load, you'll lose 99% of your traffic. Reducing that to 2 seconds is only doubles the conversion rate. So, if the user clicks on a button within a couple of seconds, they'll assume that the page has crashed and go elsewhere. Obviously, that's if you've got logged in editors and things, that time is a little bit longer because they tend to sort of allow for that kind of length of time. But what happens when the user clicks away? Like, when a user closes a tab on your browser, there's no guarantee that that script will finish to its completion, And the server timeout. So this is some defaults here I found. So PHP has an execution time of 30 seconds. The Drupal recommended memory limit is 256 megs, and you've got Apache and Nginx on top of that. And even if you give a gig of memory or like 90 seconds of execution time, that reduces the amount of server that your traffic that your server can actually respond to, because you've taken all your resources up. But on top of all this stuff, you've got CDNs like Cloudflare and stuff, which have their own timeouts. So if you're looking at a 30-second page load, you're going to have problems really. Like at some point along the line, something's going to stop that interaction. So the problem really is trying to do too much in one page request. It might be downloading lots of data from an API. I know a couple of APIs I've used in the past have been quite slow, like up to a minute just to download the user's information. And so we've had to put that behind a batch load to make give the user a nicer interface. And then you might want to create or update lots of entities, that kind of thing. So doing that in a single page request is kind of a problem, because users will get bored and click away, or your page might run out of memory. So this solves that problem really. So it splits these long-standing tasks into smaller chunks really, and then it gives you this interface. So you might have seen this progress bar. This is a Batch API running. This is using one of my examples, but if you ever see this inside Drupal, you might see it in like update hooks, or when installing modules or installing translations. It's used quite often inside Drupal itself. So, yeah. So let's look at running some batches. I've got a bit of code to show, and then I've got some demos I can do to show the code in action. So you can think of the Batch API in 3 stages, really. So you've got this initialize stage where you set everything up, and then you define all the callbacks and what's actually going to run the code, and then you've got your process, which is where your callbacks are actually where the meat of your actual code is happening, and then you've got your finished callback, which is where at the end of your process, this finished callback is called, and you can then report on what happened and log entries and things, or redirect the user to a different place. So inside Drupal 8 Plus, we've got this batch builder class. So this is used to help you set up your batch. So you've got your, you just use it, include its namespace, and you can instantiate your new object. And then you get a bunch of methods you can use to set up things. So you can set the title of the process, what the finished callback would be, and then some other stuff about labeling all the progress bar information and what happens if an error happens. And then you add your operations. So this add operation method is used to add operations into your processor. What this code is doing is taking a number between taking a range of numbers between 1 and 1,000, splitting them into chunks of 100. So there's 10 chunks, and then looping through those chunks and adding them into this operation here. So we've got then 10 batch operations that have 100 items in each. And then we set the batch running using this toArray and this batch set function. So the whole purpose behind the batch builder is to generate an array, which we then send into the batch interface. You can just build the batch interface using raw arrays, but I found them to be a bit clunky. Like this batch builder is much easier to understand, much easier to sort of debug and manipulate. But doing this will trigger the batch process and redirect the user to the the interface that we saw before. So the process method then, so you call your callbacks that you added in your batch operation, and the parameters are then expanded into things. So what we've got here, we've got ID and chunk here, so there's two arguments, and they appear in here, so the batch ID and chunk. What you always get as the third parameter is this context array. So this context array is passed as the last parameter and is used to track progress. So the context is probably where you spend most of the time looking, really. So you've got a couple of different things you can use. So sandbox is introduced to the batch process as it's run, but it's thrown away at the end of the batch process. And then results is where you sort of count how many items you did and things. But that's sent to the finished callback, so you can look at reporting on what happened during the batch run. And you might do some stuff like this. So you could, we set a maximum value on our sandbox parameter here, and then initialize some zeros across the board with how many items were skipped or passed or failed or whatever. You also get this message parameter. So if you set this message, this is a translation function which sets some information for the user, but that will appear above the progress bar. So if your batch is running, every time you send this message back to the system, it will update the progress bar, and you'll get a nice interface about what's happening in the batch. And then you perform your task. So what this is doing is we're using the random object inside Drupal. This is a Drupal thing you can use. And we're basically creating a node with a name of 15 characters and 2 random words, just to sort of create some content. So what this will do in the end is create 1,000 pages of the article content type in chunks of 100 items each. So we'll just loop through so each batch process contains, this chunk array here contains 100 items. And so the call the batch process will rerun 10 times and will create 1,000 items at the end of it. And it looks a bit like this. So you get your batch process here. This is the progress bar running. And you can see behind here we've got, it's calling the batch endpoint, sending an ID of 14. That's our current batch process ID. And it just basically calls the batch API. That responds with some AJAX callback, which then is used to update the progress bar. And then the finish callback itself. So when the batch finishes, you get this callback, and a set of parameters is detail how the batch performed. So first is success. So if your batch passed, you didn't have an error during the batch process, then this is true. Otherwise, it's false. The results is the contents of your context results array. So that will be how many items you created, how many items you skipped or whatever. Operations contains all the operations that haven't been completed yet. So if your batch fails, then you can extract information from this to see what happened during your current batch run. So the first item in that array is the batch run that failed. So you can kind of process that information there. And then the batch API sends us a lapsed method parameter, which is basically a string that tells us how much time has passed during the batch run. So this might say like 15 seconds, which is why it's a string and not a number. That's generated from the elapse is generated from the response object, so it's actually like a server time. So it works quite well. And we might do something like this. So what we're doing here is getting the messenger object or messenger service and just printing out how many items from our results object, that results parameter, we're done. There we are. So the batch API itself is really an extension of the queue system. So when you add operations to the batch, you're really adding to the queue. It's a special queue for the batch operations. And then, there's a Drupal batch runner will pick an item out of the queue and run it as a batch process. So the finished state, so far we've talked about pre-configured batch runs, so you set everything up beforehand and then run it. Whereas you can have this finish property, which is where you can just start the batch run and then you can decide when you're finished or not. So by default, the finish property is 1, so it assumes that when you call the batch process, the batch callback, that it is the only time it's going to be called. But if you set that to lower than 1, then it will be called again until it's finished. So it requires a slightly different setup set, so you might not need to send lots of different operations. You might just have one operation. So this is a change from that code we saw earlier. So instead of chunking it into 10 items, we're just sending the whole array into the batch processor. And then we do something like this. So we say the progress divided by max is less than 1. Then that will return a value less than 1. As soon as that hits the equals parameter, these two items are the same, then it will be 1 and our batch will finish. So it also means that we don't even need to send that array. We can work out how much time or how much work we need to do in the first item of the batch run. So as we start our batch, this progress will be empty, and then we can figure out this is just a node query that finds out how many nodes there are in the site. And so we know our maximum result there. If we want to go through every node on the site, we can do. So I would use the finish state over the pre-process where possible. But obviously, you don't always know beforehand how many items you need to progress. But if you can do, then I would suggest using the finish state as a prerequisite. You can also run Drush with batch. Sorry, run batch with Drush. So set things up as normal. So you do your batch sets with your to array, and then you call this drush backend batch process. So that will run batch in the backend using the command line. It looks a bit like this. So this is our chunks of 100 items per 1,000 items, and we get it finished. And notice here though it says 0 seconds. That's because the elapsed time is based on the server response time. And if you do it in batch, that doesn't exist. If so, do it in drush, it doesn't exist because you're not timing it using the response objects. So just something to watch out for. But be careful with drush because it will process all the batch operations in the same memory space. So when you do it in the front end using the website, it will call the batch page over and over again. So you'll basically be resetting every time you do the batch run. With drush, you might find some memory problems going on. So you might not necessarily find timeout problems. It depends on your setups, but you can certainly run out of memory if you're not careful. So let's look at some batch APIs in action. So first we've got the API using a form. So this is a form. It's just a standard form class with a button on it. So this is the button. And we're running our batch builder here. So we've got, call our batch builder. We're looking at the same class. So the batch form is actually self-contained in this thing. Can everyone read that okay? Yeah? And you've seen this code already. We're looping through 1,000 items. All these examples are trying to do things that are non-destructive to your site, so you can install the module wherever you like and have a play without having to destroy your site too much. So that all these things just count to 100 or 1,000 and do nothing really. So the batch processor then, we've got our progress updates here. We send a message back, and then in here what we're doing is rolling a dice basically between 1 and 4, and then counting based on the different operations that a random number generator basically, just to simulate something happening. We're also sleeping a bit because otherwise the counting to 1,000 is done in like milliseconds. You don't even notice the batch progress bar finishing. And then the batch finished, so we create our messenger, and then we print back to the user what happened, and then we add a log entry to it. If something did go wrong, then we can extract the last item or the first item out of the operations array and then print out what the arguments were that went into the batch that failed. So the example class I have, or example module I have, has all these different components in. Each of these is a self-contained module, so you can just install the module you want and have a look. But if I run that, it will do a batch run, which does nothing. Next we have using drush. So the difference here is that we've got, so this is our class that runs drush commands. So this is the kind of setup you need for a drush command itself. And you can see here's the same code, basically creates a batch operations with 1,000 items in and then runs this batch process. I think the only difference here is that instead of it being self-contained in the form, we create a standalone class. So this class just contains the batch operations in it. And the beauty about that is that we can call it from the form and then call it from drush as well. There's not too much difference needed between the two different ways of doing it. And then we can run that. So that's the batch running as a drush command, which runs exactly the same code. It's just separated out slightly differently. And processing a CSV file. So this happens like a lot. I do CSV files a lot. So I'll show the form first, actually. Yep. So we've got a form with a button on it, and I can create 1,000 items as a CSV file. Pop it in here, and I won't click the button just yet, but so we've got the upload form here that we can upload a file to. This is the validate form. So in the validation handler in a form, what you do is you copy the file from temporary location to a less temporary location, which basically means it's managed by Drupal inside the Drupal database. And then in our submit handler, we basically call a single batch process. So we add a single batch operation with, and all we're doing is sending the file URL or URI. So all the batch process knows about is the file. And if we then go to the batch class itself, so in here we've got the file name, because we sent a single parameter to our batch process, and our context array. So what we're doing here is we're figuring out how big the file is and sending that information to the user. How far away through the file are we? And then we set the seek parameter. So what we're doing here is fseek. Open the file handler here, and then fseek will fast forward into the file the number of bytes that we have in our seek operator. We then use fget_csv to extract the information from the CSV file line by line, which we then feed into our process here. So this will do some noddy validation to say we've got 2 items in our CSV line, and then create a node based on the random characters basically. But the key difference here is we're only doing 50 items at a time. So we've got a limit here and a count. As soon as we hit that limit, we then break out of the loop, and then we use the ftell command to update the seek parameter. And then we then figure out, using the finish callback, how far away through the file we are. So as we then enter because if it's less than 1, the batch process will be called again. So as we jump into the top of this, it will skip all this setup code and then come down here. And then fseek will then fast forward that number of bytes into the file. So it will pick up where we left off, and we can then keep processing the CSV file from that point onwards. So if I run that, it will create 1,000 nodes in a few seconds. So my database is now crammed with loads of data. Yeah, so I thought I'd do the CSV file this way around, because I have seen people process the CSV file into an array at the beginning of the batch process, and then send the whole array into the process methods. The problem with that is that if your CSV file is gigabytes in size, which is not unreasonable, that will fail before the batch process has got started, because you can't process a gig in a single page request. Whereas using this method, it doesn't matter how big it is, it'll just churn through the file until it's finished. So a quick look at the Batch API inside Drupal. So if you've installed modules, or you've loaded translations, or you've imported configuration or anything, you'll have seen this progress bar running, and I call that a direct usage of the API. So it'll use the batch builder to build the batch, and then progress whatever it needs to do. So if you've probably seen the Batch API running in the past, but this is also this indirect stuff. So when you run an update hook, you've probably seen a sandbox variable, and I've seen it for years and not really used it much, but that is actually the Batch API interfacing with the update hooks. So you can run batch through the update systems. In fact, it's given to you for free. So the only difference is that you need to put a hash in front of the finished flag, otherwise it doesn't carry through. So here's an example of an update hook that uses that. So at the top here, we've got, we're doing noddy stuff. So we're doing 1,000 items again. We're just figuring out what the range of our progress bar is. And then we're not doing anything in here. We're just looping through the items. But at the bottom here, we're calculating how far through the batch process we are. So obviously in a update hook, you wouldn't necessarily create entities, but you would do it in the post-update name hook, because that's got the full sort of hook systems built in. But you might want to update, for example, all of the lots of configuration items. So some of the contrib modules will use this hook to update lots of configuration items, and they'll use this system to make sure that that configuration update will happen successfully, rather than failing halfway through your configuration update, which isn't the best. So some tips on using the API. So if your data needs to get processed in real time, then use a batch. Otherwise, I would use a standard queue. So if your data is like is important to the user then and there, then use a batch system. So if they click a button and expect the result, then I would use the batch. Otherwise, use standard queue and get the cron interface to update to process your items asynchronously. You can kick off batches from a form or controller, but I would separate them into a separate class so you can run them wherever you like. So we saw when I was doing the drush command that I had a separate class. I would prefer to do that overall, because then you can call it from a form or the batch system or the drush system, or wherever you like. Use the finish property to make things dynamic. So instead of figuring out beforehand what the batch system will have in it, then figure out inside the batch system as you're doing it. Keep the operations simple, so break them apart into separate operations if needed. So I've only looked at doing a single operation, but you can certainly add more operations. So that's what the migration system does. So if you kick off a migration that has a dependency, it'll run the dependency as one batch operation, and then run the actual thing you want to migrate as a second operation. And that's how migrations work, really. The thing about the operation, the operation you're doing, try to keep them small. Be careful with timeouts. They can crash your batch. I think the batch crash interface isn't that nice. So if you do have an error in your batch process, you get this weird big red screen of batch issues. So try to avoid that if possible. You don't want your users seeing that necessarily. Good rule of thumb is to try to allow your batch operations to pick up where they left off. So if let's say you want to publish every node on your website, you don't need to tell the batch operation beforehand all the nodes you have. You just need to, load it using SQL inside your batch operation. And so what you can do is, if it does crash for any reason, you can just rerun it, and it should then continue off from where it left. When to use it? Well, so if you're trying to do a process that looks at multiple items, then move it into a batch. But users will more readily wait for a batch to finish. That progress bar is an important user interface component. And but I would start with the batch system earlier rather than later. So it's if you're going to process a lot of nodes, rather than having a form, big complex form that does all this manipulation and processing, I would start it in the batch system early, so you can, rather than converting a big complicated form into that later. A couple of example modules that use batch. So the queue UI. So I talked about queues, and this is an example of a website that has a few queues on it. You'll notice that you can click a batch, so you can actually click a checkbox and run a queue as a batch process. I still think batch processes in their own right have their own use, like if you want to give your users instant feedback, but you can actually default to a queue and then use UI to run the queue anyway, so you're not lost there. View batch operations. So this is basically a views plugin around batch, so you can create a view with a load of checkboxes on it. Kind of looks like the content admin page. But the important bit is you can create your own actions, so you can interface with the batch without having to worry about all this batch setup stuff. You can just concentrate on what's in the view, and then yeah, it'll just process your items one by one. There's also batch views data export. So this is a similar views plugin that will export everything to a CSV file. I've got an example of a CSV generation code in the examples module. But what this will do is, it'll generate a link, and you click on the link and you download the file. There's a few different ways of generating files in batch, but this seems to be the common one is put a message to the user with a link to the file. I also came across this batch plugin. I've not used it, but you can wrap the batch API in a plugin, which means that you're concentrating on just writing the code that you want to run in the batch. So this is an example of running a Drush processor using a batch plugin. Interesting if you want to abstract things another level. But some resources. So yeah, I've written recently a lot about the batch API on Hashback Code. And all of these batch examples, so that module I showed, is available on that website. I don't know if you've seen Drupal at your fingertips, but if you go to /bq, that's a lot of code about how to run batch and queue, some of which I've shamelessly stolen. I did ask the author, and he said it was okay. So I do know Selwyn, who wrote Drupal at your fingertips. But it's a really good resource about looking at sort of batch and queue together. Any questions? How am I doing for time? Right on schedule? Go.
Thanks. So I haven't used the migrate API in a while. If you're using the migrate API, is there batching in that already, or would you actually use the batch API with migrate? Say if it was like a kind of scheduled migration or something like that of a lot of.
Yeah. So when you're running a migration, I don't have one locally, but you'll see the progress bar, and it's basically the migrate API is built upon batch.
Oh, is it? Okay,
so it's already there, right?
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
One example then that's related then is that you said that you could say the memory could be exhausted. Is there any ways around that apart from just taking smaller batches? Is there like a way of like saying, I don't know, running PHP on a kind of remote server that does the Drush run it and then goes back? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
the website essentially.
yeah. Well, that's fundamentally it, isn't it? You don't want to crash the website. I do have clients who have multiple webheads,
Right.
and so we run batch on Drush batches on one of the webheads because it then frees the space on the other ones. Yeah.
So that's kind of standard practice.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's got its uses. So I had a client one time who had an API that took a long time to download data, and what we did is overnight we would pre-cache all the data for users who needed it, and that took like 2 or 3 hours a night. So,
Right.
but that was running an overnight process. So yeah, and that worked quite well.
Nice. On a different web page.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Anything else? No, I keep you from coffee now. So thanks a lot.